This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 233. Are we doing foreign aid the wrong way?
Now, one of the measures in the UK to cut government spending to compensate for the extra cost of COVID is to cut the amount Britain sends overseas in foreign aid. Now, regular listeners to this podcast will know that expenditure doesn't have to be cut if we follow the principles of modern monetary theory, but that aside, is foreign aid necessary? Well, of course it is, but is it done right? Well, that is a bigger question, and maybe there are better ways world governments could help those countries that are struggling to feed their children. Are we doing foreign aid wrong? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Now, in the latest spending review from the UK government this year, the Chancellor announced he would reduce the UK's foreign aid budget from 0.7% of national income to 0.5% of national income. That's going to amount to about £10 billion next year. But, you know, we shouldn't be too concerned about this, of course, because the UK will return to the original expenditure once the fiscal situation allows. Obviously, the developing world isn't having as tough a time of it as the West is having, is it? That's why they can do without that money. And they're going to be more focused as well. This is the second point on how that money is spent to deliver the maximum impact for every pound spent. So obviously, that wasn't the policy before. They were just splashing the money around willy-nilly. But Steve, even at 0.5%, I mean, that's quite generous, actually, compared to other wealthy countries. The US and Australia, for example, give just 0.2% of national income. So what's your thinking on this? I mean, is the figure right? Does it need to be more? Does it need to be less? Do we need to agree on a set figure, and are we doing it right anyway? What's your thought on the whole approach to foreign aid globally?
Yeah, well, I actually worked in overseas aid for about 5 years of my life. I was an education officer with the Australian Freedom of Hunger campaign from 77 to 80, and then from 80 to about 82, 83, I worked with the United Nations Association of Australia to run a project that I came up with myself to run seminars on how different countries cover each other in their press. So I ran a seminar between Australian and Chinese journalists in Beijing in 81, 82. And, of course, in the middle of that, I spent a fair bit of time going to the Department of Foreign Affairs. I've forgotten what the Overseas Aid Division was called as well. And I saw how the charities behaved too. And it left me rather cynical about the whole area of overseas aid. Because you might remember a particular member of the Australian Ponzi scheme set called Laurie Connell. But Laurie Connell was in Western Australia, and the West Australian Premier once remarked he'd hate to stand between Laurie Connell and a bucket of money. And a similar thing applies to local Australian companies, particularly American companies, British companies, and so on. They see the foreign aid budget a way of selling more of their own products to a third world country.
Yeah, so there's that, isn't there? That we are using it to look after our own self-interest, and then there's also the whole political thing as well. So the biggest recipient of aid from the United States per capita, I mean, it's largely military aid, is Israel. Hardly a country that's that is struggling to survive. But it's actually very difficult.
Well, it is, but not for the usual reasons.
Yeah, but not. I mean, they're not hungry, though. I mean, obviously there's the big risk there. But it's actually difficult. I went looking to try and find out where it comes from and where it goes. It's actually really very difficult, particularly if you look in the United States. Which agencies? There's many different categories. For example, take Afghanistan, for example. The US pays $3.6 billion to the Afghan Security Forces Fund, $3.6 billion, and $240 million for the Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund. So they're putting in, relatively small money to rebuild Afghanistan and paying a whole heap of money to keep the security forces there. And, if you take that Reconstruction Trust Fund as an example, sovereign government spends $7.5 billion on that, but the US pays just $240 million. So they're paying just 3% of that. So there's this big focus on military in terms of how much money the United States is paying out, and less on rebuilding the damage that's being done by the military.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Actually, do you even know the cartoonist Ron Cobb? He wrote some brilliantly, he's an American. He actually did most of the graphics for Star Wars and Alien and stuff like that. He lived in Sydney,
right,
of all things. But he had one of his favourite cartoons. They were always sending up American foreign policy. And one of my favourite cartoons by him had a Mexican, which is the appropriate thing for American aid, back against the wall because he's been held there by the right hand of a distant body, while the left hand of the same body was trying to feed food to his starving mouth. And the Mexican says, "Excuse me, senor, does your left hand know what your right hand is doing?" And I saw this all the time. I mean, the extent to which something which starts as a way of altruistically trying to help out countries to advance through development aid turns into a way that it's exploited by your domestic interests to be a form of export subsidy. And the Americans are even worse, as you say. They make it a military subsidy. So you give 20 times as much to the security forces, which of course enforce your version of American values, as you do to Reconstruction. Yeah. So if it was just coming down to the whole moral principle of Britain's support for the rest of the world, I'd be up in arms and how terrible it is they're cutting it back by 0.2% of GDP. But what it translates to is less interference, frankly. Yeah. And in many cases, like if you look at Indonesia's attitude to the IMF, if you say you're from the IMF and you fly to Indonesia, they're likely to send your plane back as a submarine because they were so horrified by its imposing austerity to every problem. The solution was more austerity. That the IMF and the World Bank are particularly close to being companies non grata in Indonesia.
So is that because there's this, well, we're going to fund you, we're going to help you out of the crisis that, or the problems that you currently face, but you're going to have to pay it back? I mean, is that the problem? Rather than it being it's a loan rather than a grant.
It's partly the loan rather than a grant, yes. But in the case of grants, I would take these things seriously if they said, we're giving this money to you directly and you can decide how to spend it. Or we set up an international institution in which the money goes and you have effectively a bank account, because the only reason to want foreign aid is because you want to use foreign money to buy something. We know there's any country with its own currency can create as much of that currency as it wishes, and that applies to developing countries as well. So they don't need foreign money to mobilise domestic resources, but they do need foreign money to buy capital goods, sometimes expertise that they can't bring in locally. So when you look at that, that'd be the benefit of it. But the trouble is it's tied up in so many strings, and there's so much corruption in how it's actually allocated and used at the national levels as well. I mean, I've seen plenty of Ethiopians I know and some Nigerians telling me that the foreign aid is a conduit to make the wealthy in those societies more wealthy and more powerful. So it's a very, very compromised area, and I really, I feel no qualms about seeing the UK dropping its amount from 0.7 to 0.5.
Until we find a better way of, or more effective way of distributing it. But then we need to look at what everyone else is contributing as well. Of course, if people aren't paying the same amount. But just getting back to this idea that a country with a sovereign currency can just produce more of its own currency, that's less easy, isn't it? If it's a relatively small country and the problem is huge. So you need to, proportionate to the amount of money that's in circulation, you need to produce so much more that you are going to create inflation. And then we know what happens then. If the inflation runs away, then everyone starts using the US dollar and the local currency is kaput. There's a limitation on how far you can go with that, isn't there, really? Particularly for very small countries. There was
a limitation in terms of whether you've actually got resources to mobilise. And like most developing countries have an enormous reserve of, either workers in low-wage sectors, that you could employ with extra money created by the government and so on. Of course, you've also got the issue of corruption and how that money is allocated, and that's you'd be happier about that money being allocated or created in Singapore, for example, than you would be in. I won't choose a country that But a lot of other third world countries, you would be more worried about corruption of those than you would in a place like Singapore out of domestic money creation. But it's fundamentally, if you look at foreign, there's no point in getting foreigners to provide money to you which you use to buy domestic resources. That's just forget it.
And you're not going to have that inflation problem if you're creating jobs. So so long as you keep on expanding the money supply, so long as you're creating additional jobs, additional work, then inflationary pressures.
So long as you're employing people who are currently unemployed and actually putting downward pressure, in a sense, on wages and so on. But the foreign aid thing. As a developing country, there'll be some technologies you can't produce domestically, or if you do, then you've got to build the expertise up over time. So in all those cases, you can say yes, there's a reason that foreign aid would be beneficial, because it means you don't have to try to run as much in the way of export industries to produce generate the foreign currency you need for local development of infrastructure and local capital creation. But overall, I ended up so cynical out of the whole foreign aid game, and not just the government, but also even some of the charities. There's an expression which was used to describe some particularly Christian agencies, where they said they are rice Christian agencies. In other words, they end up having a scheme which fundamentally involves feeding some section where there's a famine of some description, and they expect you to convert to Christianity. And there were, I'm not going to give names and drills, but I saw some instances of that happening, and less than enthusiastic, let's say, about even the charity side of those organisations, let alone the governments, where it tends to get taken over by the local corporate interests, and then in the case of the Americans, military interests as well. And so these things end up being distortions for countries trying to develop rather than assistances to them.
And then, of course, a lot of these countries are very corrupt. So look at, one of the poorest nations is the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. 100 million people, they've got starvation, they've got rigged elections, they've got corruption, they've got civil unrest, they've got violence against women.
You're not talking about America for a change, eh? Okay, right. So Congo,
this is even worse than America. 20% of the girls there don't go to school. They've got a huge ethnic mix and all the conflict that creates. They've got the massive deforestation as they try and get food together. How do you even? They've got the whole thing going on in Congo. How do you even start to fix problems like that when there's just so many problems?
Yeah, and it often is you want to have people who are responsible to the domestic political scene. So in that sense, foreign money actually money leads people in the direction the money lies. And if you have foreign money coming in and it's substantial, and you've got people who are willing to take advantage of the temptation, then that temptation is pretty damn overwhelming. And it's more, if you're dependent upon foreign aid, you're more likely to be a country where corruption applies than the one where you reject the foreign aid.
Yeah, well, so, actually, they get from what I can figure out, they get about $2 billion in foreign aid a year, which is $20 per person. 100 million people there. That's 5 cents a day. So maybe enough to create corruption, not enough to fix things. But that is the problem, isn't it? How do you get the money to the right people? How do you get it to the people who need it rather than to the politicians who are going to take that money and use it for themselves? Because obviously these are sovereign nations. You have to allow them that sovereignty. So it is a big hurdle to overcome.
Well, the only way that I could see it being practically done would be if the money was given in a definite, third-hand way, that the country giving the money literally puts the money in a development bank where it's then accessible to the administration of the recipient country, and there's no controls whatsoever. Now, that's just about as likely as American, particularly the Republican Party, voting in favour of eliminating gerrymandering. They're not going to do it. So when you're left with a very, very easily corrupted system, there are lots of very well-meaning, well-intentioned, good-hearted bureaucrats trying to ensure that these things are done responsibly. So I'm not going to do the public choice nonsense of saying they're all in it for themselves. There are, people in the foreign aid sections that I personally met in Australia, had a lot of respect for. But at the same time, you see that the part of the requirements they're under are to direct that work back to Australian companies. Now, Australia, with its free trade fetish, often did more to prevent that than most of the countries would do. In America, it's so blatantly, this is for the sake of pushing American values and American companies around the globe, that it's rotten and it goes to zero. I think it actually be an improvement over being 0.2%.
So do we need more centralized efforts then? Like, for example, the World Food Program, I should say. They're just trying to fix the World Food Problem. You go to their website, they say they're helping 17.3 million children in 59 countries, giving them nutritious meals. They receive about $7 billion a year in contributions. The US gives a chunk of that. Actually, 2.9 billion of that comes from the United States, but still less than the 3.8 billion it gives in military aid to Israel. But anyway, it's all relative. So the World Food Program costs about, by those figures, about $400 per child to feed them. So a child with malnutrition, to fix that problem, is $400. That's about per year. So about a bit over $1 a day for 17 million children. But there are 400 million children in Africa, and there's reports that a third of those suffer from chronic malnutrition. So by the same metrics, to feed them all would cost actually about $55 billion. Now there's about 1 billion people in the US and Europe. Forget about the rest of the world, but the developed world in the United States and Europe. So $55 a year from each person would pay for every child in Africa to receive nutritious meals. That actually doesn't sound like a big ask, does it?
No, it's not a big ask. And then what you've got there is it going through a multilateral organisation. And the multilateral organisation is at least a barrier to that level of corruption building out of, using foreign aid as a way of promoting your domestic companies. So I'm more in favour of the multilateral organisations getting funding than seeing it go from one country to another country with the corruption at both ends being quite feasible. So that'd be the preferable thing. Cut back from 0.7 to 0.5, or even go from 0.7 to say 0.2, but give another 0.2 to the multilateral organisations. That'd be an improvement. Again, my exposure to multilateral organisations, if in any ways they're too conscious of removing the possibilities for corruption. So I was actually once contracted by one of these organisations, and the maximum I was allowed to charge was $500 a day, and I'm afraid that was barely more than my academic salary. So, I was actually losing money to do work for them because they had these limits to prevent corruption. So they go a bit too far in the opposite direction, but I'd rather that end than the totally mendacious foreign aid of the current American system. So
isn't that a better way? I mean, no one can agree to anything. I mean, just look at the way the EU's operating now. But I mean, in an ideal world where the developed world could get together and actually say, well, let's tackle some of these problems and do it in a way where we all work together rather than looking after our own interests. Then if you say, well, okay, the World Food Program is a good start because we need to feed people who are struggling, and that would be one point. Another one, obviously, is we need to help build infrastructure. So maybe have some sort of infrastructure agency. I mean, is that the best way forward? You just chunk it up like that and then get everyone to agree that they are just going to contribute to these centralized funds, and these centralized funds determine which parts of the world are most in need by some sort of formula, and that takes the politics out of the whole situation, because everyone then is just saying, well, okay, we agree to provide whatever it is, 0.2, 0.3, 0.5% of our national income to these global agencies. That'd
be the better approach, but it's got a snowflake's chance in hell of actually being implemented.
Why?
The thing would. Well, because it involves both the donors and the recipients admitting that there are massive flaws to the current system, and let's go to a less flawed system, which takes power out of our hands. And particularly looking at the American political system, there are plenty of corporations who play for plenty of lobbyists who want that power to remain, because that becomes a way in which they get a large amount of very lucrative revenue. So. And then at the domestic level, again, people would find all sorts of reasons to object to it going through a multilateral organisation rather than direct country to country. But those objections would quite frequently be papering over the fact that, well, a lot of that's money going into my Swiss bank account. So,
yeah.
I've got an enormous amount of cynicism about this area from having spent 5 years in it.
Right, but it's a problem that needs to be fixed because there's a lot of hungry people in the world, and obviously everyone benefits the more those developing or undeveloped nations move up the ladder and start to become. There's absolutely no reason in the world as to why Africa as a nation has been forgotten. I mean, it has all the resources, has the population, climatically, okay, it's got a couple of deserts, but by and large, it's very habitable, and there's no reason why it couldn't be a developed continent. It's got a hell of a long way to go.
Yeah, but that then comes down to what actually achieves development, and the arguments there, the neoclassical stuff about free trade is empirically nonsense. I've mentioned a few times Danny Roddick's work on this front and a few others. But when you look at countries that are successfully developed, they've done it by domestic protection, promoting domestic industry, pretty much using that capacity of local money creation to benefit local businesses, but force them to industrialise rapidly and to become competitive internationally rapidly. That's Japan, South Korea, and then ultimately China as well have all done this, and it hasn't been a case of free trade. It's been protectionism. Even the United States, one of Michael Hudson's most significant books was called America's Protectionist Takeoff. So that development phase is something which involves creating domestic resources, though you might initially need to import the foreign ones. So it's the foreign aid as it's done at the moment is so distorting overall that
So you think there's a concern that if they become too successful, then they are going to become too competitive, and the West doesn't want that to happen? Do you think that's part of the problem?
Well, that's part of the problem too, but it's also like physically in terms of the planet itself. We're going to have a massive drop in production. I think that's going to be inevitable in this century. Whether that's enough to enable human civilization to survive is another question. But in that process, of course, you're not going to want Africa and so to go backwards. You want to go forwards, if anything. That's the part of the world where there's such a low level of energy consumption per head and such a low level of income per head that's one where you want to see that boosted to have a sustainable human society across the whole planet. But foreign aid, I see it as one of those things that it sounds so good. When you give it the Christmas card treatment, they know it's Christmas time and blah blah blah. It looks such a wonderful and generous thing to do, but its actual practice has been very corrupting and very much directed towards the interest of the donor rather than the recipient.
But I wonder whether you've just hit upon actually what the, if there was to be a focus from the West on how you do deal with Africa in a way that is going to be good for Africa and not damaging to the planet, and is also going to keep the balance of the global economy. I wonder whether you've just hit upon it, the idea that, well, okay, here's a case study that can be put into reality of a continent that if it was to follow the way that we have all gone, would lead to a massive increase in carbon. But if it's done right, then you could have a carbon neutral approach, and and therefore the West is going to help invest in that vision, so that these could become self-sufficient economies that are also very green economies. And maybe if the more foreign aid was focused on that at the same time as helping all those kids who need the nutrition, so that they can be educated, so that they can help to deliver this green economy.
That's
a utopian vision, isn't it? Really, I love the sound of it.
A lot of the stuff is utopian, and then the reality is rather more base than the utopian vision. So I'd be looking, I was looking at ways that you can actually say, well, it's going to provide these resources. What are the mechanisms you've got in place to make sure it's not done for the benefit of the donor, and then ends up enhancing corruption in the recipient country, and overall going through international agencies rather than country to country, I think is absolutely essential. And then on top of that, when you're looking at the case of if we want to try to bring sufficient power, energy per head to Africa to enable development to go there, then that would have to be 100% renewable focused, or nuclear if that's at all feasible, as some of our Patreons are fairly emphatic about, rather than coal-based power systems, rather than transportation systems that increase the use of carbon and so on. It's feasible, but again, I mean, having seen it happen, I'm seeing all these pigs flying around.
And also, you have the countries saying, "Hang on a second, you're doing what you've always done. You're giving us money, but you've got conditions attached to it." And so, are you really changing anything? But there's always been conditions attached, and there's always been politics behind all of this. I mean, we go back to the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. I mean, that was a heap of American money really there to strengthen Western Europe, to try and stop the Soviet Union taking control and communism, because that was the biggest threat to the world at the time, of course.
But that actually, when you look at it, the Marshall Plan was successful both for America and Europe. And then in that case, I mean, you had a completely devastated, particularly the Germany and Italy after the war, industrially developed, was destroyed by the bombing. The same for most of the continent. There was a huge need to rebuild, and you had a social infrastructure focused upon that. When you've got destruction like that, then there's often a pretty strong focus upon rebuilding on the other side. When you've had 150 years of colonialism and the rundown of domestic capabilities as well, which is what gave Africa its current situation, then you don't have that sudden transition to say, well, we've got to rebuild it, and you can just be feeding into local systems of power and corruption.
So the other problem we've got, of course, is that that drop from of 0.2% or whatever it was, from 0.7 to 0.5% of national income in the UK was very easily done. There wasn't a great deal of opposition. There was some, but by and large, it was, after a few people yelled and screamed for 24 hours, the deal was done. And as many people were yelling and screaming saying this is really bad, there were just as many voices saying, well, no, we pay too much in foreign aid. And that's when you start hearing all these crazy cases, like, for example, the fact that Britain gives £71 million, which isn't a great deal of money in the scheme of things, but it sends it to China. So you've got the world's fifth biggest economy giving aid, obviously very targeted, to the world's second largest economy. And you start hearing lots of stories like that. That's all gone now. They're not giving any money to China. That 71 million's gone, but so's another 4.2 billion. But that is the problem, is that there's not a lot of overwhelming public support for foreign aid. So it is very easy to cut. And if you cut it, then obviously the rest of the world is suffering.
Yeah, I mean, the only way to really achieve it safely was here we go again, back to Keynes. Keynes's proposal for the Bancor, because the idea behind the Bancor was that Keynes wanted to limit the scale of current account deficits and surpluses, and the idea was you'd have a fixed exchange rate to a international currency, which was tied to the amount that you got of that currency was tied to the size of your own economy. All international trade would be in the Bancor, and if you therefore had a trade deficit, you'd start running out of Bancor, you'd be forced to devalue. But if you had a trade surplus past a certain level, and I think it was only 2% of GDP, there was a tax imposed, and other pressures as well to encourage the countries running a surplus to bring in more imports and rebalance. But the tax was also used to go and develop third world economies. So what you had there was nobody could complain about this, because the whole mechanism is there to reduce the level of international imbalances. And since we're living in a world where that wasn't done, and we can see the scale of imbalances, it'd be a damn sight better place if Keynes' idea had come into place, and that would have an automatic provision of money effectively through a multilateral agency back to the recipient countries. That would work much, much better. So I'd rather see, if I'm going to see any form of foreign aid, I'd like to see it coming through an international payment system as well, which took away the domestic political opprobrium we see at the moment.
Simplistically beautiful, isn't it? Of course.
It's so simple. Most of Keynes's ideas were, when we came to a reform proposal, was simple and effective and stuffed up by America.
It had a formula behind it as well, which I like, because normally when you get a large organisation, well, you look at the EU, for example, they've finally agreed, but they've been spending an age trying to agree on their, getting their budget through for the next 7 years, including that recovery fund, because of the problems they're having in former Eastern European countries. And if each country looks after, if you've got a global body and everyone's looking after their invested interests, you're never going to get anywhere. So what about the charity sector? then? So, I mean, we get in the UK, we pay about £10 billion to charity, domestic charities as well as international charities, which actually, after these latest cuts, is pretty much the same as what we pay in foreign aid. So I'm just wondering whether, if the issue is that, as I've been saying, that a lot of people are against the idea of foreign aid because they say, we need to look after our own first. How many times have we heard that argument? But is there a way that we could democratize foreign aid so so people take more of an interest in what's happening around the world, and people are paying money? Maybe it's, maybe more than a tax write-off. Maybe the government is saying, well, we're going to spend this money. You tell us how we're going to spend it. And you do it that way. So you're taking the politicians out of the path of determining how you're going to split up that foreign aid budget.
Yeah, this is one area where I definitely want politicians to be less involved in both countries, both the domestic, both the aid giver and the aid receiver. So anything that did that would be preferable what we do at the moment. But again, these are discussing how many angels can dance on the head of a pin compared to the strength of political and monetary interests going in the opposite direction. And that the political interests want to minimise the amount of money given at the national level, but maximise the economic clout of that in terms of the relationship in America between the Congress and companies. So it's just such an area of such institutional corruption now. With the simple idea like the Bancor, we wouldn't even need to have this conversation. But without it, we've got this mess where every possible negative element of human behaviour you can think of is thrown in an area that's supposed to be, a font of the good human behaviour.
But we could, I'm not going to let us get away with you saying that it's too insurmountable a problem, because we've got to be idealists if you're going to drive change. And it seems so the issue. So we've highlighted the issues. The issues are corruption on both sides. In the corruption of the recipient country, where it might be going to the head of state, and then on the delivering country, choosing that country because they think they can get something out of it. There'll be some sort of kickback in terms of trade benefit, like here's a whole load of money, but you must buy a whole load of our jets, for example. So we know that's an issue. And then the other issue is, how do you prioritise from one country to another, and how do you make sure that countries are developing in a way which is going to be sustainable for the planet? We know all of those are the issues. And if you were to talk to the population of the Western world and say they're the issues, do you think we should fix all of those? Everyone would obviously say yes. Even those people who are saying, well, I'm not keen on foreign aid, you say, well, okay, what about if we did all of those things? Everyone would say, well, obviously that's what needs to be done. And then if the answer to that is, well, okay, by the way, we also, to fix all of those problems, we need to make sure that the United States doesn't have the reserve currency, the global reserve currency. People might, outside the United States, everyone going, you beaut, what a great idea. Let's do it tomorrow. Yeah,
but the United States will block it. And it used to be, the old expression used to be that the congressman for Seattle was actually the member for Boeing. That hasn't worked out all that well. But the extent to which commercial interests in the states corrupt the political process, which corrupts the aid giving.
Well, how devastating would it be for the United States if the US dollar wasn't the world's reserve currency?
Well, I think it would actually be an improvement for the USA, because I think it's been a poisoned chalice, taking on the role of reserve currency. And Yanis Varoufakis covers very well the reasons that this is a negative, because if you provide the currency the entire world needs for trade, then the entire world needs your money over and above its need for your goods and services, and therefore you have an overvalued currency, which will actually run down your manufacturing and export capabilities over time, which is precisely what America has done.
There you go.
It's benefited the financial sector, but not the industrial economy.
So sell that idea to America. Set up the Bancor and set up global
and Bob's your uncle,
and then set up those global agencies to help those countries to deal with the extra money they're going to get from the developed nations as we try and balance out the balance of currencies around the world.
And as I always say, well, I don't know, but I will say now, good luck with all that.
That's all we just need to do now is do it. Well, at least we know the plan. At least we have a plan. That's a start. Good to talk, Steve. Look, interestingly, we're going to talk about foreign trade, so we're halfway there. We talked about foreign aid. We're going to talk about foreign trade next week. Thanks for your time.
Sounds cool. Okay.
Yeah, because as we're recording this, it looks very, very likely that the UK is heading to a no-deal trade arrangement with the EU. That's going to be more tariffs, more paperwork, and presumably less trade between the two entities. So does that automatically mean both sides lose out, or will Britain rely more on its own produce, less grapes and more potatoes? We'll look at all of that next week on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Catch you again very soon. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.